She was just a quiet 8-year-old who hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years, dismissed by everyone as the broken girl who would never find her voice. But when cruel classmates dared her to say something, anything, as a twisted joke during lunch, what happened next stopped the entire cafeteria cold and changed everything. Her single father had been fighting an uphill battle, watching helplessly as the world wrote off his daughter, until one moment of unexpected courage revealed the truth everyone had missed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground of Willowbrook Elementary, where 8-year-old Paisley Morgan sat alone on the wooden bench beneath the old maple tree. Her dark curls fell like a curtain around her face as she traced patterns in the dirt with the toe of her worn sneaker, a habit she'd developed during the countless hours of silence that had become her world. 3 years had passed since anyone at school had heard her voice. 3 years since the accident that took her mother and left Paisley locked in a silence so profound that even the school counselors had begun whispering words like selective mutism and permanent damage when they thought no one was listening. But her father, Garrett Hill, listened to everything. Garrett was the kind of man who wore paint-stained work shirts and carried band-aids in his pockets, not because he was clumsy, but because he'd learned that fatherhood meant being prepared for anything. At 34, he'd already lived through more heartbreak than most men twice his age, but losing his wife Sarah in that rain-slicked car crash had nearly destroyed him. The only thing that kept him standing was the little girl who'd survived the accident but hadn't spoken since that terrible night when the sirens wailed and the world as they knew it ended in twisted metal and shattered glass. The other parents at Willowbrook Elementary didn't know what to make of Garrett Hill. He worked construction during the day, building houses for families who still had whole lives to fill them, then spent his evenings learning sign language from YouTube videos and researching speech therapy techniques on his phone until his eyes burned from the screen's blue light. He attended every parent-teacher conference alone, sitting in those tiny plastic chairs that weren't built for his broad shoulders, listening to well-meaning educators explain why his daughter might never speak again. Some trauma runs too deep, they'd say, their voices carefully modulated with professional sympathy. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this might be permanent. But Garrett refused to accept permanent. Permanent was a word for broken appliances and dead car batteries, not for his little girl, who still hummed wordlessly while she colored and still reached for his hand when thunder rolled across the sky. He'd seen the way her eyes lit up when she watched old musicals on their battered television set, how she'd mouth along to the songs, even though no sound would come. There was music trapped inside Paisley Morgan, and Garrett Hill was determined to find the key that would set it free. The bullying had started small, as these things usually do. First, it was just curious stares from her classmates, then whispered questions about why Paisley never talked. But children can be cruel in their innocence, and what began as curiosity slowly morphed into something darker. They'd wave their hands in front of her face to see if she'd react. They'd ask her questions they knew she wouldn't answer, then laugh when she simply looked away. Mrs. Patterson, Paisley's third-grade teacher, tried her best to intervene, but there are limits to what one adult can control in a classroom of 28 energetic 8-year-olds. The worst of it came from a boy named Trevor Walsh, whose father ran the biggest construction company in town and had never missed an opportunity to remind Garrett that he was just a day laborer whenever their paths crossed at school events. Trevor had inherited his father's mean streak, along with his perfectly pressed polo shirts and expensive sneakers. He'd discovered that Paisley's silence made her an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back or tell on him because she couldn't tell anyone anything at all. Maybe she's not really mute, Trevor had announced to his little gang of followers one Tuesday afternoon. Maybe she's just pretending to be special. I bet if we dared her to talk, she'd break and show everyone she's just weird. The other kids had laughed, but there was something uncomfortable in their laughter, the kind that comes when you know you're crossing a line, but don't have the courage to stop. They'd surrounded Paisley during lunch that day, forming a circle around the picnic table where she sat quietly eating the peanut butter sandwich Garrett had packed with a little note that said, "Love you, sunshine," even though she couldn't read. It back to him. "We dare you to say something," Trevor had said, his voice carrying that particular brand of playground cruelty that adults forget exists until they witness it. "Anything, just prove you're not completely broken." The cafeteria had grown quiet in the way that happens when children sense drama unfolding. Even the lunch ladies had stopped their chattering, sensing tension in the air like animals before a storm. Paisley had looked up from her sandwich, her large brown eyes moving from face to face, taking in the expectant smirks and the camera phones that had somehow materialized in small hands. This was entertainment to them, a chance to finally crack the mystery of the girl who never spoke, but they had no idea what they were about to unleash. What happened in that moment would ripple through Willowbrook Elementary like stones thrown into still water, changing not just Paisley's life, but touching every person who witnessed it. The dare that was meant to humiliate would instead reveal something extraordinary. A voice that had been waiting 3 long years for exactly the right moment to emerge. And when it finally came, it wouldn't just break the silence that had surrounded Paisley Morgan like a glass wall. It would shatter it completely, leaving everyone in that cafeteria to understand that some gifts are worth waiting for, and some miracles come disguised as ordinary moments in the most unexpected places. The little girl who'd been written off as damaged was about to show them all that being different didn't mean being broken. It just meant being brave enough to find your own way back to the light. But first, she had to find her voice. And when she did, it would be more beautiful than anyone could have possibly imagined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground of Willowbrook Elementary, where 8-year-old Paisley Morgan sat alone on the wooden bench beneath the old maple tree. Her dark curls fell like a curtain around her face as she traced patterns in the dirt with the toe of her worn sneaker, a habit she'd developed during the countless hours of silence that had become her world. 3 years had passed since anyone at school had heard her voice. 3 years since the accident that took her mother and left Paisley locked in a silence so profound that even the school counselors had begun whispering words like selective, mutism, and permanent damage when they thought no one was listening. But her father, Garrett Hill, listened to everything. Garrett was the kind of man who wore paint-stained work shirts and carried band-aids in his pockets, not because he was clumsy, but because he'd learned that fatherhood meant being prepared for anything. At 34, he'd already lived through more heartbreak than most men twice his age, but losing his wife Sarah in that rain-slicked car crash had nearly destroyed him. The only thing that kept him standing was the little girl who'd survived the accident, but hadn't spoken since that terrible night, when the sirens wailed and the world as they knew it ended in twisted metal and shattered glass. The other parents at Willowbrook Elementary didn't know what to make of Garrett Hill. He worked construction during the day, building houses for families who still had whole lives to fill them, then spent his evenings learning sign language from YouTube videos and researching speech therapy techniques on his phone until his eyes burned from the screen's blue light. He attended every parent-teacher conference alone, sitting in those tiny plastic chairs that weren't built for his broad shoulders, listening to well-meaning educators explain why his daughter might never speak again. Some trauma runs too deep, they'd say, their voices carefully modulated with professional sympathy. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this might be permanent. But Garrett refused to accept permanent. Permanent was a word. For broken appliances and dead car batteries, not for his little girl, who still hummed wordlessly, while she colored and still reached for his hand when thunder rolled across the sky. He'd seen the way her eyes lit up when she watched old musicals on their battered television set, how she'd mouth along to the songs even though no sound would come. There was music trapped inside Paisley Morgan, and Garrett Hill was determined to find the key that would set it free. Set it free. The bullying had started small, as these things usually do. First, it was just curious stares from her classmates, then whispered questions about why Paisley never talked. But people can be cruel in their innocence, and what began as curiosity slowly morphed into something darker. They'd wave their hands in front of her face to see if she'd react. They'd ask her questions they knew she wouldn't answer, then laugh when she simply looked away. Mrs. Patterson, Paisley's third-grade teacher, tried her best to intervene, but there are limits to what one adult can control in a classroom of 28 energetic 8-year-olds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The worst of it came from a boy named Trevor Walsh, whose father ran the biggest construction company in town and had never missed an opportunity to remind Garrett that he was just a day laborer whenever their paths crossed. At school events, Trevor had inherited his father's mean streak, along with his perfectly pressed polo shirts and expensive sneakers. He'd discovered that Paisley's silence made her an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back or tell on him because she couldn't tell anyone anything at all. What happened in that moment would ripple through Willowbrook Elementary like stones, thrown into still water, changing not just Paisley's life, but touching every person who witnessed it. The dare that was meant to humiliate would instead reveal something extraordinary. A voice that had been waiting 3 long years for exactly the right moment to emerge. And when it finally came, it wouldn't just break the silence that had surrounded Paisley Morgan like a glass wall. It would shatter it completely. The morning routine at 1247 Cedar Street had become a carefully choreographed dance of silence and understanding. Garrett Hill would wake at 5:30, shower quickly, then pad down the narrow hallway to peek into Paisley's room, where she lay curled beneath her yellow quilt, clutching the stuffed elephant that had been with her since the accident. He'd learned to read the subtle signs of her moods. The way she positioned her pillow told him if she'd had nightmares, and the arrangement of her books on the nightstand revealed whether she was feeling brave enough to face another day at school. Their small 2-bedroom house sat on the quiet end of Cedar Street, where the pavement cracked and the streetlights flickered on rainy nights. It wasn't much. Garrett's construction wages barely covered the mortgage and Paisley's therapy appointments, but it was theirs. The walls were painted a warm cream color that Sarah had chosen during her final pregnancy, back when they'd believed their family would grow and fill every corner with laughter. Now those same walls held different treasures: Paisley's artwork from school, family photos that stopped abruptly 3 years ago, and a collection of handwritten affirmations that Garrett had started taping up after particularly difficult days. "You are brave," read one note beside the bathroom mirror. "Your voice matters," proclaimed another by the kitchen window. Garrett had read somewhere that positive reinforcement could help trauma survivors, so he'd filled their home with little reminders that Paisley was loved, valued, and heard, even in her silence. The breakfast table held its own language. Paisley would tap once on her orange juice glass if she wanted more, twice if she was finished. She'd point to the cabinet if she wanted cereal instead of toast, or draw a smiley face on a napkin if she was feeling good about the day ahead. Garrett had learned to interpret every gesture, every expression, every slight movement of her small hands. It was exhausting and beautiful in equal measure, this constant attention to the nuances of communication that most parents took for granted. The Drive to Willowbrook Elementary took exactly 12 minutes, winding through the older part of town, where Victorian houses stood shoulder to shoulder with modern apartments and corner stores. Paisley would watch out the window, occasionally pointing at dogs or interesting clouds, and Garrett would narrate their journey like a tour guide. "There's Mrs. Chen working in her garden again," he'd say, or "Look how green the maple trees are getting." It was a one-sided conversation, but conversation nonetheless. At school, Garrett had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics that surrounded his daughter's condition. There were the well-meaning teachers who spoke to Paisley in overly gentle voices, as if she were made of glass. There were the parents who whispered sympathetically about that poor little girl, while simultaneously steering their own daughters away from potential friendship, and there were the administrators who'd grown tired of dealing with what they saw as a problem that wouldn't resolve itself. The accident had happened on a Wednesday evening in October, when the first frost had made the roads slick and treacherous. Sarah had been driving home from her book club, Paisley buckled safely in the back seat, when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything forever. Sarah had died on impact, and Paisley had spent 3 days in the hospital with a concussion and 2 broken ribs. But it was the emotional wounds that proved most devastating. The last words Paisley had spoken were to her mother right before the crash. "Mommy, I love you to the moon and back." She'd been practicing the phrase for weeks, wanting to surprise Sarah with the complete sentence. Now, those words felt sacred and final, too precious to be followed by anything ordinary. Dr. Rebecca Santos, the trauma specialist they'd been seeing for 2 years, explained it as a form of psychological preservation. "Sometimes when we lose something precious through speaking," she'd told Garrett, "we protect what remains by choosing silence. Paisley isn't broken, she's protecting something valuable." But understanding the why didn't make the daily reality any easier. And sometimes, late at night, when she thought he was asleep, Garrett would hear soft humming coming from her room, wordless melodies that spoke of everything she couldn't say. Those moments gave him hope that somewhere inside his quiet daughter, music was waiting to break free. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday in late March. Spring had begun to creep into Willowbrook, painting the school grounds with patches of green and filling the air with the promise of warmer days ahead. Paisley had seemed particularly content that morning, drawing elaborate butterflies on her napkin during breakfast, and even managing a small smile when Garrett made funny faces while packing her lunch. Trevor Walsh had been watching her from across the cafeteria, his mind already churning with the kind of mischief that seemed to follow him like a shadow. At 9 years old, Trevor had learned that power came from finding weakness in others, and Paisley's silence had always struck him as the ultimate vulnerability. He'd been building up to this moment for weeks, gathering a small audience of followers who hung on his every word and laughed at his every joke, regardless of how cruel they might be. "Today's the day," Trevor announced to his table of admirers. "I'm going to prove that weird girl is just faking it. Watch this." The approach was theatrical, designed for maximum impact. Trevor stood up from his table with exaggerated purpose, motioning for his friends to follow as he made his way across the cafeteria. Other students began to notice the procession, conversations quieting as heads turned to see what entertainment Trevor Walsh was about to provide. Mrs. Patterson was helping a kindergartner open a stubborn milk carton when she noticed the crowd beginning to form around Paisley's table. She began moving toward the situation, but the cafeteria was crowded, and she had to navigate around overflowing trash cans and clusters of chattering students. Trevor reached her table with the confidence of a performer taking center stage. He planted his hands on the laminated surface and leaned forward, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet section of the cafeteria. "Hey, mute girl," he said, using the cruel nickname that had followed Paisley through 2 years of elementary school. we've got a challenge for you." The circle of students tightened around the table, phone cameras appearing as if from nowhere. Paisley looked up from her lunch, her large brown eyes taking in the faces surrounding her, each one wearing an expression of anticipation mixed with uncomfortable excitement. "We dare you to say something," Trevor continued, his voice growing louder as he fed off the attention. "Anything at all. Just prove you're not completely broken and weird. Come on, just say one word. Everyone knows you're just pretending anyway." The cafeteria had grown surprisingly quiet, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Paisley sat frozen for a moment, her half-eaten sandwich forgotten, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. She could feel the weight of all those stares, the pressure of their expectations, the cruel hope that she would either break or provide them with more evidence of her strangeness. What happened next would change everything, not just for Paisley, but for every person in that cafeteria who witnessed it. The moment stretched like a held breath, balanced on the edge of transformation, waiting for a little girl to find the courage to reclaim something that had been hers all along. From across the cafeteria, Garrett Hill pushed through the heavy double doors that separated the school hallway from the lunch area, his work boots squeaking slightly against the polished linoleum floor. He wasn't supposed to be there. His lunch break from the construction site 3 miles away didn't usually align with Paisley's school schedule, but something had drawn him to Willowbrook Elementary that day. The scene that greeted him stopped him cold. His daughter sat surrounded by a circle of students, their faces lit with the cruel anticipation of people who'd stumbled upon entertainment at someone else's expense. And at the center of it all stood Trevor Walsh, issuing his dare with casual cruelty. Garrett's protective instincts flared immediately, but years of single parenthood had taught him that charging in like an angry bull rarely solved anything. He could see Paisley's small shoulders tense, could read the fear and confusion in her posture even from 20 feet away. Mrs. Patterson finally broke through the crowd of students, her usually gentle voice carrying an authority that cut through the tension like a blade. "That is enough," she announced. "All of you, back to your seats immediately. This is not entertainment." But Trevor, emboldened by his audience, didn't retreat. "She's just faking it. Everyone knows it. She talks to her dad at home, I bet. She's just trying to be special because what?" The voice that interrupted Trevor was calm, but carried an undercurrent of steel. Garrett had moved closer without anyone noticing, his presence suddenly filling the space around Paisley's table. He wasn't shouting, wasn't displaying anger, but there was something in his bearing that commanded immediate attention. "Because she's different?" Garrett continued, his voice remaining steady. "Because she processes the world in ways that don't fit your neat little boxes? Because she's been through trauma that would break most adults, let alone an 8-year-old. Girl?" The cafeteria had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the distant hum of the refrigeration units. Students who had been eager for entertainment moments before now shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far more serious than a schoolyard dare. Mrs. Patterson stepped beside Garrett, adding official weight to his words. "Mr. Hill is right," she said. "We're talking about courage here, and I think you all need to understand what real courage looks like." Garrett knelt beside Paisley's seat, bringing himself down to her eye level. "You know what I see when I look at my daughter," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the cafeteria. "I see someone who survived something terrible and is still finding ways to share kindness with the world. I see someone who communicates in a dozen different ways that don't require words. I see someone who doesn't owe anyone an explanation for how she chooses to exist in this world. And I see someone who is perfect, exactly as she is, voice or no voice." The silence that followed was different, a hush of understanding, of recognition, of shame in some cases. Several students had tears in their eyes, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they'd almost participated in. Trevor himself had gone pale, his earlier bravado deflating as the reality of his actions settled over him. As the crowd began to disperse slowly, Garrett felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The sense that his daughter wasn't alone in this journey. But even as relief flooded through him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been building towards something larger. And as he looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw something new there. A flicker of possibility that hadn't been there before. That evening, the house on Cedar Street felt different somehow, as if the very air had shifted during the hours Garrett and Paisley had been apart. Dinner was quieter than usual, not the comfortable silence they'd grown accustomed to, but something more charged, like the stillness before a storm. Paisley pushed her spaghetti around her plate with unusual distraction, her brown eyes distant and thoughtful in ways that Garrett had learned to recognize as significant. He waited until after the dishes were done and homework was spread across the kitchen table before broaching the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. Paisley was working on a math worksheet, her pencil moving with careful precision as she solved multiplication problems, when Garrett pulled up the chair beside her and cleared his throat gently. "So," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone. He'd perfected over 3 years of navigating difficult conversations with a daughter who couldn't respond in traditional ways. That was quite an afternoon we had. Paisley's pencil stopped moving. She didn't look up from her worksheet, but Garrett could see the slight tension that entered her shoulders, the way her breathing became more deliberate. These were the micro-expressions he'd learned to read like a language all its own. The subtle communications that had become their primary means of understanding each other. "You know what I realized today?" Garrett continued, settling back in his chair and adopting the casual tone that usually helped Paisley feel less pressured. "I realized that I've been so focused on protecting you from the world that I might have forgotten to ask what you want from it." This time, Paisley did look up, her dark eyes meeting his with a directness that caught him off guard. For a moment, father and daughter simply studied each other across the small kitchen table, years of unspoken understanding passing between them in the space of a heartbeat. Garrett reached across the table and gently touched the back of her hand. "Mrs. Patterson called me after school," he said. "She wanted to talk about what happened today, but she also wanted to tell me something else. Something about you that I think you might want to hear." Paisley's eyebrows rose slightly, a question forming in her expression that she couldn't voice, but that Garrett understood perfectly. She said that during art class last week, when the other students were working on their paintings, you helped Emma Bell mix colors for her landscape. Not just helped. You showed her how to create this beautiful shade of purple by layering different hues together. Mrs. Patterson said Emma told her it was the best artistic advice she'd ever received. A small smile tugged at the corners of Paisley's mouth, the first genuine expression of happiness Garrett had seen from her since the cafeteria incident. "And last month," Garrett continued, encouraged by her response, "when that new student, James, was having trouble with his reading, you spent your entire recess sitting with him, pointing to words and helping him sound them out. Mrs. Patterson said his reading improved more in that one afternoon than it had in weeks of formal tutoring." Paisley's smile grew wider, and she nodded slowly, remembering. "What I'm trying to say, Sunshine, is that you've been finding your voice all along, just not in the way people expect." Garrett paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But today, when Trevor was being cruel, when all those kids were watching and waiting for you to break, I saw something in your eyes that I haven't seen in 3 years." Paisley tilted her head slightly, a gesture that asked him to continue. "I saw you wanting to speak. Not because someone was forcing you to, but because you had something important to say." Garrett leaned forward slightly. "And I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be right here. But there's no pressure, no timeline, no expectations, except that you continue being exactly who you are. What happened next surprised them both. Paisley reached across the table and picked up one of her colored pencils, a deep blue one that had always been her favorite. On the margin of her math worksheet, she began to draw, not the usual butterflies or flowers that typically decorated her schoolwork, but something different, something deliberate. Garrett watched in fascination as a scene began to emerge under her careful strokes. First, there was a small figure sitting at a table, clearly meant to be her. Then surrounding that figure, she drew other people. A tall man in work clothes who was obviously Garrett, a woman with silver hair who could only be Mrs. Patterson, and several smaller figures representing her classmates. But these weren't the menacing circle from the cafeteria. These people were positioned protectively around the central figure, their faces kind rather than cruel. As she drew, Paisley began to hum. It was so soft at first that Garrett almost missed it, just a gentle melody that seemed to rise from somewhere deep in her chest. But gradually, the humming grew stronger, more confident, filling the quiet kitchen with something that sounded remarkably like hope. The humming continued for several minutes as Paisley added details to her drawing. Flowers around the edges, a sun shining overhead, even small birds perched on the shoulders of the protective figures. When she finally set down her pencil, she looked up at Garrett with eyes that seemed clearer than they had in years. Then, something extraordinary happened. Paisley pointed to the drawing, then to herself, then to Garrett. The gesture was simple, but unmistakable. This is my world and you are part of it, and I am safe here. But she wasn't finished. Reaching for another colored pencil, this one a warm yellow, she added one more element to her drawing. In the space above the protective circle of people, she drew what looked like a speech bubble. It was empty, waiting to be filled, but its presence spoke volumes about possibility and potential. Garrett felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he understood what his daughter was trying to tell him. She wasn't ready to speak yet, maybe not for a while, but she was ready to believe that someday she might be. The voice that had been locked away since that terrible October night was still there, still part of her, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said gently. Paisley nodded. "That humming you just did, that was beautiful. Have you been doing that more often lately?" Another nod, this one accompanied by a small, almost shy smile. "And the drawing, this picture of all of us protecting you, is this how you felt today, when Mrs. Patterson and I stood up for you?" This time, Paisley's nod was emphatic, her whole body participating in the gesture. Garrett reached across the table and gathered his daughter into a gentle hug, careful not to overwhelm her, but unable to resist the physical expression of the love that threatened to overflow his heart. "You know what I think," he whispered into her dark curls. "I think today was the beginning of something new, not the end of your silence, necessarily, but maybe the beginning of understanding that you have choices about how and when to use your voice." When they separated, Paisley picked up her pencil one more time. In the empty speech bubble she'd drawn, above her protective circle, she wrote 3 words in her careful, precise handwriting: "I am brave." Garrett stared at the words, understanding their significance in ways that went far beyond their simple meaning. For 3 years, he'd been telling Paisley that she was brave, writing it on notes around their house, whispering it to her during nightmares, hoping that somehow the words would take root in her heart. But this was the first time she'd claimed that bravery for herself, the first time she'd written those words in her own hand as a declaration rather than an aspiration. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, you are." As they cleaned up the kitchen together that night, moving through their familiar routines with a new sense of purpose, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The protective bubble they'd built around their Quiet life was still intact, but it no longer felt like a prison. Instead, it felt like a launching pad, a safe space from which Paisley could choose to venture forth when she was ready. The humming that had emerged during their kitchen conversation continued as Paisley got ready for bed, soft melodies that seemed to carry years of unexpressed thoughts and feelings. And as Garrett tucked her in that night, he noticed that she'd placed her drawing on the nightstand where she could see it from her pillow, a reminder of the day she discovered that she wasn't alone and that bravery could take many different forms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the house on Cedar Street felt like a place where miracles might actually be possible. The weeks following the cafeteria incident brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere at Willowbrook Elementary. Word of what had happened spread through the school with the particular efficiency that only elementary school gossip could achieve. But instead of the usual whispered cruelties, something different emerged. Teachers began paying closer attention to the dynamics in their classrooms. Parents had conversations with their families about kindness and differences. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way people looked at Paisley Morgan began to change. Mrs. Patterson was the first to notice the transformation, and she was determined to nurture it carefully. The veteran teacher had seen enough young lives altered by single moments of crisis or triumph to understand that the window of opportunity now opening for Paisley was precious and fragile. She began making small but significant adjustments to her classroom environment, creating what she privately called safe spaces for growth. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Patterson said to Garrett during their scheduled conference 2 weeks after the incident, "about ways we might help Paisley explore different forms of expression. Not to pressure her into speaking," she added quickly, seeing the protective wariness that immediately flickered across his face, "but to give her more tools for communication." Garrett leaned back in the too small chair, his carpenter's hands folded carefully in his lap. These parent-teacher meetings had become easier over the years, but he'd never lost the underlying tension that came with discussing his daughter's future with people who, however well-meaning, couldn't fully understand the depth of their journey. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, his tone cautious but open. Mrs. Patterson smiled, recognizing his protective instincts and respecting them. "Well, I've noticed that Paisley has been drawing more in class lately. Not just doodling in margins, but really detailed storytelling, kinds of drawings. And Emma Bell mentioned that Paisley helped her with a music project last week, something about rhythm patterns." Garrett nodded slowly. "She's always been musical, even before." He paused, still finding it difficult to reference the accident directly. "She hums a lot at home. Has been since she was tiny." "I was wondering if we might explore that," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Our school has a small music therapy program. Nothing formal, just Ms. Rodriguez, the music teacher, working with students who might benefit from alternative forms of expression. It's completely voluntary, and there's no pressure to perform or demonstrate anything publicly." The idea intrigued Garrett more than he'd expected. Music had always been Sarah's domain in their family. She'd been the one with the beautiful voice, the one who sang lullabies and knew all the words to Disney songs. After her death, Garrett had found it too painful to fill their house with music, letting that part of their lives fade into silence along with Paisley's voice. But lately, hearing his daughter's wordless melodies drifting from her room at night, he'd begun to wonder if they'd been denying themselves something healing rather than protecting themselves from something painful. "Would other students be involved?" he asked. "Only if Paisley wanted them to be. Ms. Rodriguez usually works one-on-one initially, then gradually introduces small group activities as students become more comfortable. The focus is on exploration and self-expression, not performance." Garrett found himself nodding before he'd consciously made the decision. "Let me talk to Paisley about it, see how she feels." That evening, as they sat at their kitchen table with homework spread between them, Garrett broached the subject with his usual, careful approach. Paisley was working on a science worksheet about plant growth, her colored pencils arranged in careful rows beside her notebook, when he mentioned Mrs. Patterson's suggestion. "So there's this music teacher at school," he began, watching Paisley's reaction closely. "Ms. Rodriguez. Mrs. Patterson thinks you might enjoy working with her on some creative projects." Paisley's hand stopped moving, her pencil hovering over a diagram of a sunflower. She looked up with interest, but also a hint of wariness. "Nothing like performing or anything scary," Garrett continued quickly. "Just exploring music and art and different ways of expressing ideas. Kind of like what you do when you hum while you're drawing, but maybe with instruments or other creative tools." A small smile tugged at Paisley's lips, and she nodded once, decisively. The first session with Ms. Rodriguez took place the following Wednesday, during what would normally have been Paisley's study hall period. Garrett had offered to stay, but Mrs. Patterson gently suggested that Paisley might feel more freedom to explore if she didn't feel she needed to protect her father's feelings about her choices. Ms. Rodriguez turned out to be a young woman with kind eyes and an immediately calming presence. Her music room was filled with instruments of all sizes, guitars and keyboards, but also drums and tambourines, xylophones and wind chimes, even what looked like rain sticks and other instruments Paisley had never seen before. "Hi, Paisley," Ms. Rodriguez said when Mrs. Patterson brought her to the music room. "I'm so glad you wanted to come explore with me today. Would you like to look around a bit first? Or should we sit and talk about what kinds of sounds and music you like?" Paisley pointed toward the instruments, her curiosity overcoming her natural shyness. "Perfect," Ms. Rodriguez smiled. "Why don't you wander around and see if anything calls to you? Touch whatever you want. Make whatever sounds feel interesting. There are no wrong choices here." What followed was perhaps the most joyful 45 minutes Paisley had experienced since before her mother's death. She moved from instrument to instrument with growing confidence, her fingers finding rhythms on drums, melodies on the xylophone, gentle harmonies when she discovered she could play 2 different wind chimes simultaneously. Ms. Rodriguez simply watched and occasionally joined in, never directing or correcting, just adding her own musical contributions to whatever Paisley was exploring. The breakthrough came when Paisley discovered an old acoustic guitar propped in the corner of the room. It was smaller than adult-sized, with a warm wood tone that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the music room windows. She approached it hesitantly, then looked back at Ms. Rodriguez for permission. "That's a beautiful guitar," Ms. Rodriguez said encouragingly. "It's been waiting for someone to play it. To play it." Paisley lifted the guitar carefully, settling it in her lap the way she'd seen musicians do on television. Her small fingers found the strings, and she strummed gently, creating a sound that was tentative but surprisingly musical. Then, almost without conscious thought, she began to hum along with the random chords she was creating. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful. Not a song anyone would recognize, but something entirely original that seemed to spring from someplace deep in Paisley's heart. It was sad and hopeful at the same time, complex in its emotions, but simple in its honesty. Ms. Rodriguez found herself holding her breath, understanding that she was witnessing something extraordinary. When the impromptu song finally faded away, Paisley looked up with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, but also shining with something that looked remarkably like joy. "That was incredible," Ms. Rodriguez said softly. "Have you been composing music for a long time?" Paisley shook her head, then pointed to her chest and then to the guitar, as if to say that the music had come from somewhere inside her and found its voice through the instrument. "Would you like to try writing it down?" Ms. Rodriguez asked. I could teach you some basic notation, or we could just record it so you don't forget." Paisley nodded enthusiastically, and they spent the remaining time of their session working together to capture the melody she'd created. Ms. Rodriguez showed her how musical notes corresponded to the sound she'd made, and Paisley proved to be a quick and eager student, absorbing the basic concepts with the focused intensity she brought to everything that genuinely interested her. When Garrett picked her up after school that day, he immediately noticed the change in his daughter's demeanor. There was a lightness in her step that had been absent for years, and her eyes held a spark of excitement that reminded him painfully of the little girl she'd been before their world fell apart. "How did it go?" he asked as they walked to his truck. Paisley didn't answer verbally, but she hummed the same beautiful melody she'd created in the music room, now refined and confident. Garrett found himself slowing his pace to listen, recognizing something profound in the wordless song his daughter was sharing with him. That night, as he tucked Paisley into bed, she handed him a piece of paper. On it, she'd drawn a picture of herself sitting with a guitar, musical notes floating around her like butterflies, but what caught Garrett's attention was the expression on the drawn figure's face, pure, unbridled happiness. At the bottom of the page, in her careful handwriting, Paisley had written, "Music is another kind of talking." Garrett stared at the words for a long moment, understanding that his daughter had just articulated something important about her journey toward finding her voice. Speaking wasn't the only form of communication that mattered. There were other languages, music, art, movement, touch that could carry meaning just as powerfully as words. "You're absolutely right," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "Music is another kind of talking, and you're already fluent." As he turned off her bedroom light and headed toward his own room, Garrett felt a familiar surge of hope mixed with pride. The foundation they'd been building together for 3 years, based on love, patience, and unwavering belief in Paisley's worth, was finally beginning to support something new. Not a return to who she'd been before, but an evolution into who she was becoming. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Garrett found himself genuinely excited to see what tomorrow might bring. Spring blossomed into early summer at Willowbrook Elementary, and with it came an unexpected transformation that rippled outward from one small music room to touch corners of the school community no one had anticipated. What had started as individual music therapy sessions for Paisley had evolved into something much larger, though the change happened so gradually that most people didn't notice until it was already well established. It began with Emma Bell. The shy fourth grader had been struggling with her own confidence issues, not as profound as Paisley's selective mutism, but significant enough that her parents had grown concerned about her reluctance to participate in class discussions or social activities. When Emma heard through the elementary school grapevine that Paisley was working with Ms. Rodriguez, she asked her mother if she could try music activities too. "I think Paisley might be more comfortable if she had a friend there sometimes," Emma had explained with the kind of intuitive wisdom that sometimes emerges from unexpected places. "And maybe I could learn whatever she's learning." Mrs. Bell had approached Garrett hesitantly after school one afternoon, unsure how to broach the subject without seeming to intrude on what was clearly a delicate therapeutic process. But Garrett, after discussing it with Paisley, had been surprisingly receptive to the idea. "She draws pictures of Emma sometimes," he told Mrs. Bell. "And when Emma talks to her at lunch, Paisley actually responds with gestures and expressions. I think having a peer there might be exactly what she needs." The first joint session between Paisley and Emma proved to be a revelation for everyone involved. While Paisley had found her voice through the guitar and original composition, Emma gravitated toward percussion instruments, creating rhythmic patterns that seemed to unlock something joyful and confident in her personality. More importantly, the two girls discovered they could create music together. with Paisley's melodic sensibilities complementing Emma's natural sense of rhythm. Ms. Rodriguez watched in fascination as the girls developed their own system of musical communication. Paisley would play a chord progression on her guitar, and Emma would respond with a drum pattern that somehow perfectly captured the emotional tone Paisley was expressing. Then Emma would create a rhythmic phrase, and Paisley would find melodies that transformed simple beats into something approaching actual songs. They're composing together, Ms. Rodriguez explained to Garrett and Mrs. Bell during an impromptu conference after the third joint session. Not just playing music, but actually creating original pieces that tell stories. It's remarkable, but the impact extended beyond the music room. Other students began noticing the friendship that was blossoming between Paisley and Emma, and more importantly, they began seeing both girls in a new light. Paisley was no longer just the mute girl, she was the girl who writes beautiful music. Emma was no longer too shy to speak up, she was the drummer who makes everyone want to dance. The transformation was perhaps most evident during lunch periods. Where Paisley had once sat alone or been the target of cruel curiosity, she now had a regular table companion in Emma, and their friendship had a gravitational pull that gradually attracted other students. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but slowly and organically. James, the student Paisley had helped with reading earlier in the year, was the first to join their lunch table. He was followed by Sophie, a quiet girl from Mrs. Patterson's class, who had been dealing with her parents' recent divorce. Then came Alex, a boy with ADHD who had always felt like an outsider because of his different learning style, and Maria, who was still learning English as her second language and often felt isolated by the communication barrier. What emerged was something beautiful and unexpected. A lunch table that became a safe haven for students who felt different, overlooked, or misunderstood. Paisley, in her continued silence, somehow became the center of a community built on acceptance rather than words. Her presence seemed to give other students permission to be themselves without apology or explanation. Ms. Rodriguez began to notice that the positive changes weren't limited to Paisley's immediate circle. Trevor Walsh, the boy who had initiated the cruel dare that started everything, had been noticeably subdued since the cafeteria incident. His previous confidence in his social hierarchy had been shaken by the public display of Garrett's protective love and Mrs. Patterson's moral authority. More significantly, he'd been watching Paisley's transformation from a distance, beginning to understand that his perception of her as broken had been not only wrong, but deeply harmful. The turning point came during a particularly rainy afternoon, when the students were confined to indoor recess. Paisley and Emma were sitting in the corner of their classroom, sharing earbuds connected to Emma's tablet and listening to music while they worked on homework. Trevor approached them hesitantly, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. He said, standing awkwardly beside their desk. I wanted to say something. Both girls looked up, Emma with curiosity and Paisley with wariness. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Trevor continued, the words coming out in a rush. About that day in the cafeteria, about calling you names and being mean. My dad says... He paused, struggling with something. My dad says you're probably faking it for attention, but I know that's not true. I can see that you're not faking anything. Paisley studied his face for a long moment, her dark eyes searching for sincerity. Then slowly, she nodded once. Not quite forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Trevor shifted his weight from foot to foot. I was wondering, he said, addressing Emma, since Paisley's nonverbal communication made him uncomfortable, if you guys could teach me about the music stuff you do. I play piano a little bit and I thought maybe, Emma looked at Paisley, who considered the request with the serious attention she gave to all important decisions. Then Paisley reached for her notebook and wrote something down, showing it to Emma, who smiled and nodded. She says we have music. Time with Ms. Rodriguez on Wednesdays, Emma translated. You could ask if you can join us. It was a small moment, but its significance rippled through the classroom and beyond. Students began to understand that the music sessions weren't just therapy for broken kids. They were creative workshops where anyone could explore and express themselves. More requests came in, not from students seeking help, but from those seeking community. Mrs. Patterson watched these developments with the satisfaction of an educator who understands that the most powerful learning often happens outside the formal curriculum. She began incorporating more creative expression activities into her regular classroom time, inspired by what she was witnessing in the music room. Art projects became more collaborative. Writing assignments began, including options for students to express ideas through drawings, diagrams, or even musical notations for those who preferred alternative forms of communication. The shift wasn't limited to students. Other teachers began seeking Ms. Rodriguez's advice about incorporating music and creative expression into their own classrooms. Parents started asking about the program during conferences, wanting to understand how their own sons and daughters might benefit from alternative forms of communication and self-expression. Principal Martinez, initially skeptical about the resources being devoted to what he'd seen as individual therapy sessions, began to recognize that something more significant was happening. Test scores weren't the only measures of student success, and the improvements in classroom behavior, peer relationships, and overall school culture were impossible to ignore. But perhaps the most meaningful change was evident in Paisley herself. The girl who had once moved through the school halls like a ghost, trying to remain invisible, now walked with purpose and confidence. She still didn't speak, but her presence commanded respect rather than pity. She had become a leader without using words, showing other students that differences could be strengths and that community could be built on acceptance rather than conformity. One evening in late May, as Garrett picked Paisley up from an extended music session, he found her waiting outside the school with Emma, both girls animated in conversation, or rather, Emma talking enthusiastically, while Paisley responded with expressive gestures, smiles, and the occasional written note. "We're planning a surprise," Emma announced as they approached Garrett's truck. "For the end-of-year assembly, Ms. Rodriguez said we could perform our song, the one Paisley and I wrote together." Garrett looked at his daughter, searching her face for any sign of anxiety or reluctance. Instead, he saw excitement and determination. "Are you sure you're ready for that, sunshine?" he asked gently. Paisley nodded emphatically, then pulled out her notebook and wrote, "I want people to hear our music. It has something important to say." As they drove home that evening, Garrett reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 months ago, his daughter had been the target of cruel jokes and social isolation. Now she was preparing to share her creative voice with the entire school community, not because she'd been pressured to perform, but because she had something meaningful to offer. The foundation they'd built together, based on patience, love, and unwavering belief in her worth, had become something bigger than either of them had imagined. Paisley hadn't just found her own strength. She'd become a catalyst for positive change in others, showing her entire school community that there were many ways to communicate, many forms of courage, and many definitions of what it meant to have a voice. The invitation arrived on official Willowbrook Elementary letterhead, but it was hand-delivered by Principal Martinez himself during one of Paisley's Wednesday music sessions. Ms. Rodriguez accepted the envelope with curiosity, while Paisley and Emma paused their rehearsal to watch the unusual interruption to their routine. "Sorry to interrupt," Principal Martinez said, his usual administrative demeanor softened by something that looked remarkably like excitement. "But I wanted to deliver this personally and explain the opportunity that's come up." Ms. Rodriguez opened the envelope and read quickly, her eyebrows rising with each line. "This is Significant, she murmured, looking from the letter to Paisley and back again. What is it? Emma asked, her natural curiosity overcoming any shyness about speaking to the principal. Principal Martinez smiled, settling into one of the small chairs that dotted the music room. Well, it seems that word of our music program has traveled beyond Willowbrook. The district office has been hearing reports about the positive changes happening here, and they've asked if we'd be willing to showcase our approach at the annual District Education Summit next month. Paisley's fingers stilled on her guitar. Strings! Her dark eyes wide with something between excitement and terror. It's a big event, Principal Martinez continued, his tone carefully neutral. About 300 educators from across the county, along with school board members, parents, and some community leaders. They're particularly interested in innovative approaches to student expression and inclusive education. Ms. Rodriguez studied Paisley's face carefully. What exactly would be involved? A presentation about our program, the principal explained. Maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Ms. Rodriguez could talk about the therapeutic and educational benefits. And we'd love to have some student demonstration, but only if everyone involved feels comfortable with that level of exposure. The room fell silent except for the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant sounds of afternoon activities filtering in from the hallway. Paisley sat very still, her hands resting on her guitar, her expression unreadable in the way that had become familiar to those who knew her well. She was processing, weighing options, considering possibilities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Emma, always more direct in her communication style, voiced what everyone was thinking. That's a lot of people. It is, Principal. Martinez agreed. And there's absolutely no pressure for anyone to participate who doesn't want to. We could easily showcase the program without any student performances, but... He paused, looking directly at Paisley. Your music teacher tells me that you and Emma have created something really special together, something that demonstrates exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. Paisley reached for the notebook she always kept nearby and wrote carefully. What would we have to do? Ms. Rodriguez answered gently. You could perform one of your original compositions, maybe the piece you've been working on for the school assembly, or you could just let the adults listen while you work through your creative process, whatever feels right to you. Would my dad be there? Paisley wrote. Absolutely, Principal Martinez replied immediately. Parent involvement is a big part of what makes our program successful. In fact, we'd love to include Mr. Hill in the presentation if he's willing. That evening, the kitchen table at 1247 Cedar Street became the site of one of the most important family meetings in the Hill household's recent history. Garrett had picked up pizza on the way home, their traditional big decision dinner, and spread the district's formal invitation alongside Paisley's notebook and colored pencils. So, Garrett said, settling into his chair with a slice of pepperoni pizza, this is pretty incredible, Sunshine. They want to showcase our whole journey, not just the music program, but how we've learned to communicate as a family, how the school has adapted to support different kinds of learners. Paisley nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful, rather than immediately enthusiastic. What are you thinking about? Garrett asked, recognizing the particular quality of concentration that meant his daughter was working through something complex. Paisley wrote in her notebook, then turned it toward him. What if I mess up? What if people expect me to talk and I can't? What if they think the program is stupid? Garrett studied his daughter's careful handwriting, understanding that beneath her questions lay deeper fears about performance, about disappointing people who believed in her, about being vulnerable in front of strangers who might not understand her journey. Can I tell you what I think? He said gently. Paisley nodded. I think you've already accomplished something incredible. 3 months ago, you were afraid to be noticed. Now you're considering sharing your music with 300 educators because you believe it might help other kids like you." He paused, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "As for messing up, sunshine, your music doesn't come from perfection. It comes from your heart. And as for people expecting you to talk, well, that's exactly why this presentation matters. You're going to show them that communication takes many forms, and all of them are valuable." Paisley wrote again, "What about you? Would you really want to talk about everything that happened to us?" The question caught Garrett off guard, and he realized that in focusing on Paisley's comfort level, he hadn't fully considered his own vulnerability. Sharing their story publicly would mean discussing Sarah's death, his struggles as a single father, the years of therapy and heartbreak and small victories that had brought them to this point. "You know what?" he said finally. "I've spent 3 years protecting our story, keeping it private, making sure you felt safe to heal at your own pace. But maybe it's time to let that story help other families who are struggling with similar challenges." Over the next week, the decision evolved gradually, rather than arriving in a single moment of clarity. Paisley continued her regular sessions with Ms. Rodriguez, but now they included conversations about performing for larger audiences, about dealing with nerves, about the difference between performing for entertainment and sharing music that had deeper meaning. Emma proved to be an unexpected source of wisdom during this process. "My mom says that when you share something you're proud of, it makes other people feel brave enough to share their own special things," she told Paisley during one of their joint rehearsals. "Maybe our music could help another kid who feels scared or different." The breakthrough came during a practice session when Paisley and Emma were working through their collaborative composition, a piece they'd titled "Finding Voice" that blended Paisley's melodic guitar work with Emma's rhythmic percussion and even included space for other students to join in if they chose. As they played, Trevor Walsh appeared in the doorway of the music room, drawn by the sound. "Could I?" he started, then stopped, still uncertain about his place in this new dynamic. Paisley looked at him for a long moment, then gestured toward the piano in the corner of the room. Trevor's face lit up with surprise and gratitude as he sat down at the bench and began adding gentle chord progressions that somehow perfectly complemented what the girls were creating. What emerged was something more beautiful than any of them had created individually, a musical conversation between 3 students who, months earlier, had been separated by cruelty, misunderstanding, and social hierarchies. Now they were collaborating on something that spoke to resilience, friendship, and the possibility of change. When the song ended, Paisley reached for her notebook and wrote something that she showed to both Emma and Trevor. "This is what we should share. This shows how music can bring people together." That evening, Paisley came home with a decision that surprised even Garrett with its clarity and confidence. She handed him a note that read, "I want to do the presentation, not because I have to prove anything, but because our story might help someone else." "Are you sure?" Garrett asked, studying her face for any sign of doubt or pressure. Paisley nodded firmly, then wrote an addition to her note. "But I want to do it our way, with our music, showing that you don't have to be fixed to be valuable." Garrett felt a surge of pride mixed with protectiveness as he realized that his daughter had not only found her strength, but had developed the wisdom to use it purposefully. She wasn't performing to please others or to demonstrate her recovery. She was choosing to share her journey because she understood its potential to help others. "Then let's do it," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Let's show them what courage really looks like." As they began planning for what would be the biggest public moment of Paisley's young life, neither father nor daughter could have anticipated that the presentation would become something far more significant than a simple demonstration of innovative education practices. They were about to discover that some voices, when they finally emerge, have the power to change not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of what it means to communicate, to belong, and to find strength in difference. The morning of the District Education Summit dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that made everything seem possible. Garrett woke before his alarm, as he had every day for the past week, his mind immediately turning to the day ahead and the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Down the hall, he could hear Paisley moving around in her room, not the restless tossing that had marked her sleep in the early days after Sarah's death, but the purposeful sounds of someone preparing for something important. The Oakmont Convention Center was a 40-minute drive from Cedar Street, and they'd planned to arrive early to give Paisley time to adjust to the space and run through their presentation one final time. Ms. Rodriguez had offered to meet them there, along with Emma and Trevor, whose parents had readily agreed to let their children participate in what had become a truly collaborative demonstration of the music program's impact. As Garrett helped Paisley load her guitar case into the truck, he noticed that her hands were steady despite what he knew must be significant nerves. Over the past month of preparation, he'd watched his daughter transform from someone who participated in the planning process to someone who had taken ownership of it. She'd written detailed notes about what she wanted people to understand about their journey, had worked with Ms. Rodriguez to arrange their musical piece in a way that would demonstrate the collaborative nature of their program, and had even requested specific elements to be included in Garrett's portion of the presentation. "You ready for this, Sunshine?" Garrett asked as they buckled their seatbelts. Paisley nodded, then pulled out the notebook that had become her constant companion and showed him a message she'd written that morning. "I'm nervous, but it's good." Nervous? Like before a performance, when you know you have something important to share. The convention center was already bustling with activity when they arrived. Educators from across the county moved through the lobby in small groups, their conversations a mix of shop talk and genuine enthusiasm for innovative teaching methods. Registration tables lined one wall, and directional signs pointed toward various conference rooms where simultaneous sessions would be held throughout the day. Their presentation was scheduled for the main auditorium at 2:30 p.m., with an expected audience that had grown beyond the original estimate to nearly 400 attendees. The morning sessions were focused on curriculum development and standardized testing strategies, but the afternoon would shift to what the program called alternative approaches to student success, a category that had drawn significant interest from teachers dealing with diverse learning needs and communication challenges. Ms. Rodriguez found them near the registration table, her usual calm demeanor brightened by excitement. "Emma and Trevor are already here with their parents," she reported. "They're in the green room. Well, it's actually just a conference room, but it's quiet and has a piano if anyone wants to practice." The next few hours passed in a blur of sound. Checks, final rehearsals, and meetings with conference organizers who wanted to understand the technical requirements for their presentation. Principal Martinez arrived with a small entourage from Willowbrook Elementary, including Mrs. Patterson, whose presence seemed to give Paisley an extra measure of confidence. But it was the moment when Paisley saw other students in the green room that her nerves truly settled into something manageable. Emma was sitting at the piano, picking out melodies with the focused concentration that had become her signature, while Trevor practiced rhythm patterns on a practice pad he'd brought from home. When they saw Paisley enter with her guitar, their faces lit up with the kind of genuine excitement that comes from shared purpose. "Are you ready?" Emma asked, her own nervousness evident but overshadowed by determination. "We've got this," Trevor added, his confidence surprising everyone who remembered his role in the story just months earlier. "Our music is going to show them something they've never seen before." They ran through their presentation one final time, with Ms. Rodriguez offering gentle suggestions and Garrett watching from the corner of the room, with pride and protectiveness warring in his chest. The piece they'd created together, Finding Voice, had evolved over the weeks of preparation into something truly remarkable. It began with Paisley's guitar, a solo melody that spoke of isolation and pain, then gradually incorporated Emma's percussion as friendship entered the narrative, and finally welcomed Trevor's piano accompaniment as community formed around understanding rather than judgment. But the most powerful element was what came next. In the final section of their composition, Paisley had created space for audience participation, not in the traditional sense of clapping along, but in the form of a musical invitation for others to join their story. It was ambitious and risky, requiring the kind of vulnerability that most adults would find challenging, let alone a group of students who were still learning to trust their own voices. At 2:15, they were escorted to the auditorium for final preparations. The space was larger than anything Paisley had imagined. Tiered seating that rose toward the back of the room, professional lighting that made the stage feel both intimate and imposing, and an audience that was already filing in with the purposeful energy of educators ready to be inspired. Principal Martinez took the stage first, offering a brief introduction that set the context for what the audience was about to witness. He spoke about Willowbrook Elementary's journey toward inclusive education, about the importance of recognizing different forms of communication and learning, and about the remarkable transformation that had taken place in their school community over the past year. Then Ms. Rodriguez joined him. Her presentation focused on the therapeutic and educational benefits of their music program. She shared statistics about improved student engagement, decreased behavioral issues, and increased academic performance among participants, but she also spoke about less quantifiable changes, improvements in empathy, community building, and students' willingness to take creative risks. When it was Garrett's turn to speak, he found himself looking out at an audience that was leaning forward with genuine interest. These weren't bureaucrats checking boxes or administrators looking for quick fixes. These were educators who understood that real learning often happens in the spaces between traditional subjects, and parents who recognized the challenges of supporting students who didn't fit conventional molds. 3 years ago, Garrett began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, my daughter stopped speaking, not because she couldn't, but because the world had become too painful for words. As her father, I had to learn that love sometimes means accepting silence while you wait for voice to return on its own terms. He spoke about their journey, the therapy sessions and sleepless nights, the small victories and setbacks, the gradual understanding that healing doesn't always look like returning to what was, but sometimes means evolving into something new and different and valuable. What I learned, Garrett continued, is that my job wasn't to fix my daughter or force her to communicate in ways that felt safe to other people. My job was to create space for her to discover her own voice, in whatever form that voice might take. The audience was completely quiet, the kind of attention that speakers dream of but rarely achieve. These educators understood the challenges Garrett was describing because they faced similar situations in their own classrooms every day. Students who learned differently, communicated differently, processed the world through different filters. And now, Garrett said, his voice warming with pride, I'd like you to meet my daughter Paisley and her friends Emma and Trevor. They're going to share their music with you, not as a performance to be judged, but as an invitation to understand that voice takes many forms, and all of them matter. As Paisley walked onto the stage with her guitar, followed by Emma and Trevor, the auditorium fell into the kind of silence that carries weight and expectation. She settled into the chair that had been positioned center stage, adjusted her guitar strap and looked out at the sea of faces watching her with curiosity and hope. For a moment that felt eternal, Paisley simply sat and breathed, gathering the courage that had been building inside her for months. Then she began to play, and the first notes of finding voice filled the auditorium with something that transcended music and became testimony about resilience, about community, about the power of accepting difference as strength rather than deficit. What happened next would be remembered by everyone in that auditorium for the rest of their careers, and many would later say it was the moment they truly understood what inclusive education could accomplish when approached with patience, creativity, and unwavering belief in every student's potential. The first notes of Paisley's guitar filled the auditorium with a melody that seemed to carry 3 years of silence, pain, and gradual healing. Her fingers moved across the strings with the confidence that had grown from months of practice. But more than that, they moved with the authority of someone who had something essential to communicate. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, starting soft and solitary, speaking of isolation and loss in a language that transcended words. Emma joined in after the first verse, her percussion adding layers of rhythm that transformed Paisley's solo lament into something more complex, more hopeful. The simple addition of drum beats somehow told the story of friendship emerging from loneliness, of connection forming between two people who understood what it meant to feel different. The audience watched in fascination as the girls communicated. Through their instruments, their musical conversation as clear and meaningful as any spoken dialogue. When Trevor's piano entered the composition, something magical happened in the auditorium. The melody that had begun in isolation and grown into friendship now blossomed into community. Trevor's chord progressions wove around and under the girls' music, creating harmonic foundations that supported and elevated their individual voices, while adding his own story of redemption and change. The three instruments, guitar, drums, and piano, created something together that none could have achieved alone. But it was what happened next that transformed the entire experience from performance to revelation. As the instrumental section reached its crescendo, Paisley did something she hadn't done in any of their rehearsals, something that surprised even Emma and Trevor. She began to hum along with her guitar, her voice barely audible at first, but growing stronger as the melody supported and encouraged her. The humming wasn't words, but it was unmistakably voice. The first vocal sound anyone outside her immediate family had heard from Paisley Morgan in over 3 years. The audience held its collective breath, understanding intuitively that they were witnessing something extraordinary and fragile. Even Emma and Trevor, who had become her closest musical partners, played with extra gentleness, creating space for this new element of their friend's expression. As the humming grew more confident, something unprecedented happened. Paisley looked out at the audience and, still playing her guitar with one hand, gestured with the other for them to join her. Not with words, but with whatever sounds felt right to them. It was the invitation she'd written into their composition, the moment where individual expression became collective voice. The response was hesitant at first. A few educators in the front rows began humming along, picking up the melody as best they could. Then others joined in, some humming, some adding quiet rhythmic clapping, a few even contributing soft vocal sounds that weren't quite singing, but weren't quite speaking either. Within minutes, the entire auditorium was filled with a spontaneous chorus of voices, each person contributing to the musical conversation in whatever way felt authentic to them. Dr. Patricia Williams, the district superintendent who had initially been skeptical about the time and resources being devoted to alternative programs, found herself with tears streaming down her face as she hummed along with 400 of her colleagues and community members. Later, she would tell reporters that it was the first time in her 30-year career that she truly understood the difference between accommodation and transformation. Ms. Jennifer Park, a special education teacher from across the county, was recording the moment on her phone, already imagining how she could adapt these principles for her own students who struggled with traditional forms of communication. The elementary school principal sitting beside her was taking notes furiously, trying to capture not just what was happening, but how she might begin similar programs in her own building. But perhaps the most profound response came from the parents in the audience. Mrs. Coleman, whose son had been struggling with selective mutism for 2 years, felt hope flooding through her chest as she watched Paisley's confidence and saw the community's acceptance of different forms of expression. Mr. and Mrs. Singh, whose daughter had been labeled behavior problem because of her unconventional learning style, began to envision possibilities they hadn't previously considered. As the musical piece reached its natural conclusion, the humming gradually faded into profound silence. But this wasn't the uncomfortable quiet that often follows performances when audiences aren't sure how to respond. This was the silence of recognition, of understanding, of people processing something that had touched them more deeply than they'd expected when they walked into the auditorium that afternoon. Paisley set down her guitar and stood, looking out at the faces that were looking back at her with expressions of gratitude, amazement, and newfound respect. Emma and Trevor stood with her, the three of them forming a small circle of friendship and mutual support that somehow represented everything their presentation had been trying to communicate. Then, in a moment that would be talked about for years to come, Paisley stepped forward to the microphone. The auditorium fell so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning became audible. 400 people leaned forward in their seats, understanding that something unprecedented was about to happen. Paisley looked out at the audience, then back at her friends, then at her father, sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes and pride written across every feature of his face. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong and carried to every corner of the auditorium. "Music," she said, her first spoken word in public in over 3 years, "is how I learned that my voice was never really gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to come home." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it felt eternal. Then the applause began, not the polite clapping that typically follows conference presentations, but thunderous, sustained applause mixed with cheers and even some standing ovations. Educators who had seen thousands of student presentations understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a girl finding her voice, but a demonstration of what could happen when communities created space for every form of expression to be valued and heard. But Paisley wasn't finished. As the applause continued, she stepped back to the microphone and spoke again, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Thank you for listening to our music," she said. "But more than that, thank you for understanding that there are lots of ways to have a voice. Some people talk with words, some people talk with music, some people talk with art or movement or kindness. All of these voices matter. All of these voices deserve to be heard." She paused, looking directly at the section where she knew other students and parents were sitting. "To any kid who feels different or broken or like they don't belong," she continued, "I want you to know that you're perfect exactly as you are. Your voice, whatever form it takes, is important. Don't let anyone convince you that you need to be fixed. You just need to find the people who understand that different is beautiful." When Paisley stepped back from the microphone this time, the response was beyond applause. People were standing, crying, calling out expressions of support and gratitude. Teachers were already pulling out phones to call colleagues who hadn't been able to attend. Parents were making mental notes about conversations they needed to have with their own families and schools. Principal Martinez, who had watched the entire presentation from the side of the stage, stepped forward with wonder written across his face. He'd known that Paisley's story was powerful, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of impact her words and music would have on an audience of educational professionals. As the official presentation concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, many stopping to speak with Garrett, Ms. Rodriguez, and the other Willowbrook representatives, Paisley found herself surrounded by educators who wanted to thank her personally. Each conversation was brief. She was still more comfortable with shorter interactions, but the cumulative effect was profound. Teacher after teacher, principal after principal, told her that her presentation had changed how they thought about communication, about difference, about what it meant to help students find their voices. Dr. Williams, the superintendent, was among the last to approach. "Paisley," she said gently, "what you shared today is going to help thousands of students across our district. Thank you for being brave enough to show us what's possible." Paisley smiled, the first completely uninhibited smile many people had seen from her. "Thank you for making a safe place for different voices," she replied, as they packed up their instruments. And prepared to leave the convention center, Paisley walked alongside her father with a lightness in her step that had been absent for years. She had not only found her voice, she had used it to advocate for others, to educate adults who had the power to create change, and to demonstrate that healing doesn't mean returning to who you were before trauma, but evolving into someone new and strong and valuable. The girl who had once been mocked for her silence had become a teacher, a leader, and an inspiration. More importantly, she had shown an entire community of educators that when we create space for every voice to be heard and valued, extraordinary things become possible. 6 months after the District Education Summit, the house on Cedar Street had become something of a pilgrimage site for educators, parents, and families dealing with communication challenges. Not in any overwhelming or intrusive way. Garrett had been careful to maintain boundaries that protected Paisley's privacy and normal childhood experiences, but in the quiet, meaningful way that happens when word spreads about hope and healing. The kitchen table where Paisley had once struggled through silent homework sessions was now often occupied by planning meetings for what had become known as the Willowbrook model, a comprehensive approach to inclusive education that had been adopted by 12 schools across 3 districts. Ms. Rodriguez found herself traveling to conferences around the state, sharing the therapeutic and educational principles that had emerged from their small music room. But she always made sure to emphasize that the success of their program wasn't just about innovative techniques. It was about fundamental shifts in how communities understood difference, communication, and belonging. Paisley herself had settled into a new role that balanced her natural inclination toward privacy with her growing understanding of her responsibility. As an advocate, she continued her regular music sessions, but now they often included new students, children who had been referred by teachers, parents, or counselors who had heard about the transformative power of alternative expression. Some came with diagnoses of autism or selective mutism. Others were dealing with trauma, grief, or simply the ordinary challenges of growing up feeling different in a world that often prioritized conformity. Each new student brought their own story, their own challenges, and their own unique forms of potential voice. Paisley had developed an intuitive ability to create safe spaces for exploration, perhaps because she remembered so clearly what it felt like to be dismissed, misunderstood, or pressured to communicate in ways that felt impossible. She never pushed anyone to speak before they were ready, but she consistently demonstrated through her own example that voice could take many forms and all of them were valuable. Emma had become Paisley's co-facilitator in many of these sessions, her natural warmth and enthusiasm helping to put nervous newcomers at ease. Trevor, whose transformation from bully to ally had become its own powerful story, often shared his experience with parents who were struggling to understand their role in supporting children who learned differently. His honesty about his own mistakes and growth provided a roadmap for others who wanted to do better but weren't sure how. The ripple effects extended far beyond their immediate community. Dr. Patricia Williams, the district superintendent who had been moved to tears during Paisley's presentation, had implemented district-wide policies requiring teacher training in alternative communication methods and inclusive education practices. Schools that had previously seen students like Paisley as problems to be solved or accommodated began viewing them as opportunities to expand their understanding of learning and expression. Mrs. Coleman's son, the boy who had been struggling with selective mutism, was now thriving in a classroom where his teacher understood that participation could look like written responses, artwork, or collaborative projects rather than just verbal contributions. The Singh family's daughter had been moved to a specialized program that honored her unconventional learning style while challenging her academically in ways that felt supportive rather than punitive. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in places that had never heard of Willowbrook Elementary or Paisley Morgan. Teachers who had attended the conference were returning to their own schools with new perspectives on student potential. Parents who had heard second-hand accounts of the presentation were advocating for different approaches in their own districts. The story was spreading not through formal channels or mandated programs, but through the organic network of people who recognized truth when they encountered it. On a warm Tuesday afternoon in May, exactly 1 year after her first public words, at the summit, Paisley sat in the music room with a new student, a 7-year-old named David whose foster care experiences had left him withdrawn and suspicious of adults. He hadn't spoken to anyone at school in the 3 months since his placement, and his foster parents were growing concerned about his isolation. Paisley didn't try to engage David in conversation or encourage him to touch any instruments. Instead, she simply sat with her guitar and began playing softly, letting the music fill the space between them without demanding any response. After 20 minutes, David moved slightly closer. After 30 minutes, he reached out tentatively to touch one of the strings, creating a small sound that blended with her melody. "Music doesn't ask you to be anything except exactly who you are," Paisley said quietly, continuing to play. "It just waits for you to be ready." David didn't respond verbally, but something in his posture relaxed. For the first time since arriving at Willowbrook, he looked like a little boy rather than someone braced for disappointment or betrayal. As Paisley worked with David over the following weeks, she found herself reflecting on her own journey with new perspective. The girl who had once been paralyzed by silence had become someone who understood the power of creating space for others to find their own voices. She wasn't a teacher in the traditional sense. She was still only 9 years old after all, but she had developed wisdom about healing, communication, and community that many adults spent lifetimes trying to understand. Garrett watched these developments with the complex mixture of pride and protectiveness that had become his constant companion. His daughter had found not just her voice but her purpose, and he was awed by the grace with which she carried both. But he also remained vigilant about maintaining the balance between Paisley's growing public role and her need for a normal childhood filled with friends, play, and the simple joys of growing up. "You know what I realized today?" Paisley said one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had developed a habit of sharing these sudden insights with her father, as if her expanding understanding of the world required verbal processing in ways it hadn't before. "What's that, sunshine?" Garrett asked, setting down the construction plans he'd been reviewing. "I used to think that talking was something other people did, and music was something I did instead," Paisley said thoughtfully. "But now I understand that they're both just different ways of sharing what's inside us. Some people's inside voices come out as words, some come out as music, some come out as art or movement or kindness. The important thing isn't which kind of voice you have, it's that you find people who want to listen." Garrett studied his daughter's profile as she gazed out at their quiet street, noting the confidence in her posture and the peace in her expression. 3.5 years ago, he'd been a desperate single father, watching his traumatized daughter retreat into silence, wondering if he'd ever hear her voice again. Now, he was listening to profound insights from a girl who had not only reclaimed her own voice, but had become a catalyst for helping others find theirs. "That's beautiful, Paisley," he said, "and I think you're right. The world needs all kinds of voices. Including yours," she said, turning to smile at him. "You taught me that being different isn't something to fix or hide. You taught me that love means creating space for people to be exactly who they are. That's your voice, Dad, and it changed everything." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, father and daughter sat in comfortable quiet, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of their neighborhood. Dogs barking, distant laughter, the soft rustle of wind through leaves. But underlying it all was something new, the sense that their story had become larger than their individual healing, that their journey from silence to voice had created pathways for others to follow. The phone rang occasionally with requests for interviews, invitations to speak at conferences, or inquiries from families seeking guidance. Paisley and Garrett considered each opportunity carefully, accepting those that felt aligned with their mission of advocacy and education, while declining those that seemed motivated by curiosity rather than genuine desire for change. But their most important work continued to happen in small, quiet moments. In the music room, where new students discovered they had voices worth sharing, around their kitchen table, where families learned to communicate in new ways, and in the growing network of educators and parents who understood that inclusive communities weren't built through policies and procedures alone, but through fundamental shifts in how people understood difference, belonging, and the many forms that courage could take. As Paisley prepared for bed that night, she paused at her bedroom window to look out at the neighborhood where she'd learned to be silent and later to find her voice. Tomorrow would bring new students to work with, new challenges to navigate, and new opportunities to demonstrate that healing wasn't about returning to who you were before trauma, but about evolving into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Because of what you'd survived, the little girl who had once been dared to speak as a cruel joke had become living proof that when communities choose to listen with their hearts rather than their expectations, miraculous transformations become not just possible, but inevitable. Her legacy wasn't just her own healing, it was the countless other voices that would emerge because she had shown them it was safe to be heard. And in bedrooms across the county, children who had felt broken or different or invisible fell asleep to the knowledge that their voices mattered, whatever form those voices might take. Because sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do is prove that being different isn't something to overcome. It's something to celebrate, to nurture, and to honor as one of the many beautiful ways human beings connect with each other and make the world a little bit better, one voice at a time. 2 years had passed since Paisley's first spoken words at the District Education Summit, and the impact of that moment continued to spread in ways that surprised even those who had witnessed it firsthand. What had begun as one family's journey through trauma and healing had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how entire communities understood communication, learning, and the value of neurodiversity. The Morning Mail at 1247 Cedar Street often brought letters from families across the country who had heard about the Willowbrook model through educational conferences, social media, or word-of-mouth networks. Garrett had learned to recognize the particular weight of envelopes that contained stories of struggle and hope, and he always read them to Paisley over breakfast, both of them moved by the courage of families willing to share their most vulnerable experiences Dear Paisley, read one letter from Oregon. My daughter Luna hasn't spoken in school for 8 months since we moved here from Mexico. Her teacher saw a video of your presentation online and started a music program in our classroom. Yesterday, Luna hummed during art time for the first time since we arrived. I wanted you to know that your courage gave us hope when we thought there was none left. Another letter, this one from a teacher in rural Alabama. I've been teaching for 23 years, and I thought I knew everything about reaching struggling students. Then I watched your presentation during our professional development day. Last month, I started offering my students alternative ways to show what they know, through drawings, music, movement, even interpretive cooking. My classroom has never been more alive with learning. Thank you for showing me that different doesn't mean deficient. These letters had inspired Paisley to propose something that initially made Garrett's protective instincts flare. A pen pal program that would connect students who were finding their voices through alternative means. Working with Ms. Rodriguez and a carefully vetted network of educators, they had created a safe system for children across the country to share their stories, their music, their art, and their gradual journeys towards self-expression. The program had grown to include over 200 students from 43 states, ranging in age from 6 to 16, all connected by their experience of feeling different in a world that often demanded conformity. Some were dealing with selective mutism like Paisley had. Others had autism, ADHD, dyslexia, or were simply introverted in environments that prized extroversion. What they shared was the transformative experience of finding communities that valued their unique forms of communication. Paisley's own voice had continued to evolve in remarkable ways. She spoke regularly now, though still thoughtfully, and with intention rather than filling space with unnecessary chatter. Her music had grown, more complex and emotionally sophisticated, incorporating elements from the diverse cultural backgrounds of her pen pals. She'd learned basic sign language, Spanish phrases, and even some Mandarin, driven by her desire to communicate with students whose first languages weren't English. But perhaps most significantly, she had developed what Dr. Santos called exceptional emotional intelligence, an ability to sense and respond to the unspoken needs of other struggling students that went far beyond her years. Teachers from other schools often brought particularly challenging cases to Willowbrook, not for formal intervention, but for what they called the Paisley effect, the inexplicable way her presence seemed to give other children permission to believe in their own potential. Emma had blossomed into a confident young performer, her percussion skills evolving to include complex polyrhythms and experimental soundscapes that complemented Paisley's increasingly sophisticated compositions. More importantly, she had discovered a gift for teaching, often working with younger students who were just beginning to explore musical expression. Her patient, encouraging approach had helped dozens of children overcome their initial fears about making sound in front of others. Trevor's transformation had perhaps been the most dramatic of all. The boy, who had once derived power from mocking others' differences, had become one of the most effective peer mentors in the program. His personal experience with both bullying and redemption, giving him unique credibility with students who were struggling with their own capacity for cruelty or change. His willingness to share his mistakes honestly, along with his journey toward empathy, had inspired similar transformations in other students who saw themselves in his story. The three friends had maintained their close bond, while each developing distinct strengths and interests. They still performed together regularly, but their music had evolved from simple compositions to complex arrangements that incorporated elements of classical, folk, world music, and experimental sound art. Their annual concert at Willowbrook had become a community event that drew audiences from across the region, raising funds for music therapy programs in underserved schools. On a particularly significant Tuesday in March, they received an invitation that represented the full scope of how far their influence had traveled. The National Education Association wanted them to be the keynote presenters at their annual convention in Chicago, addressing an audience of over 5,000 educators from around the world. The theme of the convention was Voices for the Future, transforming education through inclusive excellence, and the organizers specifically wanted Paisley, Emma, and Trevor to demonstrate how student leadership could drive systemic change. 5,000 people, Emma said, her eyes wide as she read the invitation for the third time. That's like more people than live in our entire town. It's an honor, Paisley said quietly, but it's also a responsibility. If we do this, we need to make sure we're representing not just our story, but all the students who are still looking for their voices. Trevor nodded seriously. Maybe we could include some of our pen pals, like have them send videos or recordings that we could share, make it bigger than just us. This suggestion sparked weeks of planning that involved students, families, and educators from across their pen pal network. What emerged was a presentation concept unlike anything the NEA had ever featured. A collaborative performance that would include live music from Paisley, Emma, and Trevor, but also recorded contributions from dozens of their pen pals, creating a multimedia experience that demonstrated the diversity and power of alternative communication methods. Garrett watched his daughter navigate these complex planning conversations with a mixture of pride and amazement. The girl, who had once been paralyzed by the prospect of speaking to her own classmates, was now coordinating with students and educators across the country, managing logistics for a presentation that would reach thousands of people and maintaining her academic responsibilities while serving as an advocate for inclusive education. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching you become the person you were always meant to be, he told her one evening as they reviewed the latest drafts of their presentation. Materials. Paisley looked up from the notebook where she'd been sketching ideas for visual elements to accompany their music. I think maybe we all become who we're meant to be when we find the right people to become it with, she said. I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me, or Emma and Trevor becoming real friends, or Ms. Rodriguez creating safe spaces to explore. It's not just about individual voices, it's about communities that know how to listen. The depth of this insight, coming from a girl who was still only 11 years old, reminded Garrett of how trauma, when met with love and support, could sometimes create wisdom that surpassed chronological age. Paisley hadn't just recovered from her selective mutism, she had transformed her experience of difference into a gift that could help others navigate their own journeys towards self-acceptance and expression. As spring moved towards summer and their Chicago presentation approached, the house on Cedar Street buzzed with activity that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. Students visited regularly for planning sessions. Educators stopped by to share updates about programs they'd implemented based on the Willowbrook model. Families drove hours just to meet the girl whose story had given them hope for their own struggling children. But perhaps the most meaningful visitor was David, the former foster student who had been one of Paisley's most challenging cases. Now 8 years old and settled with a loving adoptive family, he had found his voice through drumming and spoken word poetry, becoming a confident performer who used his art to advocate for other children in the foster care system. I brought you something, David said during his visit, pulling a carefully wrapped package from his backpack. Inside was a small drum he had decorated with painted symbols representing growth, healing, and hope. For helping me remember that being broken doesn't mean staying broken, Paisley accepted the gift with the gravity she always brought to moments of deep connection. You were never broken, David, she said gently. You were just waiting for the right rhythm to dance to. As summer approached and their national presentation loomed, Paisley, Emma, and Trevor understood that they were no longer just students, sharing their personal story. They had become symbols of possibility for countless children who felt different, misunderstood, or silenced by circumstances beyond their control. Their music had become a bridge between isolation and community, their friendship a model for how differences could complement rather than divide, and their journey proof that healing was not only possible, but could become a source of strength for helping others. The girl who had once been dared to speak as a joke was now preparing to address the largest gathering of educators in the country, not because she had been cured or fixed or made normal, but because she had learned to transform her difference into a superpower that could light the way for others walking similar paths. The Marriott Marquis in downtown Chicago stretched 49 floors into the late spring sky, its glass exterior reflecting the bustling energy of a city that never seemed to pause. In the hotel's largest conference hall, 5,000 educators from 6 continents had gathered for what would be remembered as one of the most transformative sessions in National Education Association history. Paisley stood at the window of their 20th floor hotel room, watching the ant-like movement of people on the streets below, feeling the familiar flutter of performance nerves mixed with something deeper, a sense of responsibility that had grown heavier with each letter from struggling families, each success story from other schools implementing inclusive programs, each reminder that her story had become larger than her own healing. The tech crew finished the final sound check, Emma announced, bursting through the connecting door between their rooms with the kind of excited energy that had become her signature. They said our pen pal recordings sound amazing through the main speakers. You can hear every word of Sophia's poem from Mexico, and that percussion piece from the kids in Kenya is going to blow everyone's minds. Trevor appeared behind her, his arms full of carefully organized folders containing backup plans, emergency contact lists, and detailed schedules that revealed how much his organizational skills had developed over the past 2 years. The media team wants to interview us before the presentation, he said. Something about streaming the session live for schools that couldn't send representatives. Paisley nodded, still looking out at the city that held so many stories, so many struggles, so many people searching for their own versions of voice and belonging. Are you nervous? She asked her friends. Terrified, Emma admitted cheerfully. But the good kind of terrified. Like when you're about to go down the biggest roller coaster and you know it's going to be amazing, even though your stomach is doing backflips. I keep thinking about all the kids who are going to watch this online, Trevor said, his voice more serious. Kids like I used to be, who think being mean makes them powerful. Kids like you used to be, who think being different means being wrong. Kids like Emma, who have so much to offer but don't know how to share it yet. That's exactly who we're doing this for, Paisley said, turning from the window with the kind of quiet determination that had become her trademark. Not for the adults who already understand, but for the kids who are still figuring out that they're not broken. The presentation hall was a marvel of modern conference technology, with stadium seating that rose in steep tiers around a central stage equipped with state-of-the-art sound and lighting systems. Video screens flanked the stage and hung from the ceiling, ensuring that everyone in the massive space would be able to see and hear clearly. But what struck Paisley most as they did their final walkthrough was the energy in the room. 5,000 educators who had traveled from around the world because they believed that transformation was possible. Dr. Jennifer Huang, the NEA president, who had championed their invitation, met them backstage with a warmth that immediately put them at ease. I've been following your work for 2 years, she told Paisley. My own daughter struggled with selective mutism, and your presentation video was the first thing that gave our family hope that her silence wasn't permanent. How is she doing now? Paisley asked, with the immediate focused attention she always gave to stories about other struggling children. She's thriving, Dr. Huang smiled. She started speaking again last year, but more importantly, she learned that her voice, however it emerges, matters. That's the gift you gave our family, and I know you're going to give it to thousands more today. The presentation began with a video montage that Ms. Rodriguez had created, featuring short clips from pen pals around the world sharing their stories in their own words, languages, and preferred forms of expression. A girl from Iceland sang a traditional folk song in her native language. Twin boys from Nigeria demonstrated their skill with talking drums. A teenager from Brazil shared a spoken word piece about overcoming stuttering. A group of students from a school for the deaf in California performed a visual poem in American Sign Language. Each clip lasted only 30 to 60 seconds, but together they created a powerful tapestry of human diversity and resilience that had the entire auditorium leaning forward with attention. The message was clear before Paisley, Emma, and Trevor even took the stage. Voice takes countless forms, and every single one of them matters. When the three friends finally walked into the spotlight, the applause was immediate and sustained, but it felt different from the polite recognition typically given to conference speakers. This audience understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just a presentation about inclusive education, but a demonstration of what could happen when communities chose to nurture difference rather than trying to eliminate it. Paisley approached the microphone with the confidence that had grown from 2 years of speaking to increasingly large audiences. But her voice remained gentle, conversational, as if she were talking to friends rather than addressing thousands of strangers. 3 years ago, she began, I was the weird kid who never talked. Teachers whispered about me in meetings. Other students dared me to speak as a joke. I felt broken, defective, like I was failing at the most basic thing humans are supposed to do: communicate. She paused, letting that reality sink in for an audience that had certainly worked with similar students. Today, I want to talk to you about what I learned in my journey from silence to voice, but also what my community learned about creating spaces where every form of communication is valued and heard. What followed was the most sophisticated presentation Paisley had ever given, weaving together personal narrative, educational theory, and practical strategies in ways that spoke to both the hearts and minds of her audience. She talked about the difference between accommodation and transformation, between fixing students and empowering them, between inclusion as compliance and inclusion as celebration. Emma demonstrated how rhythm and percussion could unlock expression for students who struggled with traditional verbal communication, leading the entire auditorium in a collaborative rhythm exercise that had 5,000 educators clapping, tapping, and creating music together. The experience of hearing that many people making coordinated sound filled the space with an energy that was both joyful and profound. Trevor shared his perspective as someone who had been transformed from bully to ally, speaking honestly about the fear and insecurity that drove cruel behavior, and the power of communities that chose to respond to cruelty with education rather than punishment. His words carried particular weight because they came from lived experience rather than theoretical understanding. But the climax of their presentation came when they performed their latest collaborative composition, a piece called The Conversation, that incorporated live music from all three friends with recorded contributions from their pen pals around the world. As Paisley played guitar, Emma added percussion, and Trevor provided piano accompaniment. Voices and instruments from 6 continents joined the mix through the sound system, creating a musical conversation that transcended language, culture, and traditional boundaries. The effect was magical and deeply moving. Audience members found themselves crying as they listened to a student from war-torn Syria singing a song of hope in Arabic, while a group from rural Appalachia added harmonica and mountain music, while teenagers from Tokyo contributed electronic beats that somehow blended perfectly with traditional instruments from Ghana and folk melodies from Ireland. "This is what inclusive education sounds like," Paisley said, as the music reached its crescendo. "Not everyone singing the same song, but everyone adding their unique voice to a conversation that becomes more beautiful because of its diversity." When the music finally faded, the silence lasted nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in conference presentation terms, before the applause began. But this wasn't polite professional recognition. This was the sound of 5,000 people who had just experienced something that changed their understanding of what education could accomplish when approached with genuine respect for human diversity. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. Teachers were openly weeping. Administrators were taking notes furiously. International attendees were already planning how to adapt these approaches for their own educational systems. Social media exploded with clips and quotes from the presentation, spreading the message to educators who hadn't been able to attend. During the question and answer session that followed, the themes that emerged were remarkably consistent across different countries and educational contexts. How do we shift from seeing difference as deficit to seeing it as asset? How do we create communities where every form of communication is valued? How do we measure success when traditional metrics don't capture the full scope of human potential? Paisley, Emma, and Trevor answered each question with the wisdom they'd gained from years of lived experience, but they consistently redirected attention to the broader community of students, families, and educators who had made their success possible. They weren't presenting themselves as exceptional individuals who had overcome adversity, but as examples of what could happen when communities chose to nurture rather than normalize, to celebrate rather than correct. The final question came from a teacher in rural Bangladesh who had traveled 14 hours to attend the conference. "What would you want to say to a student who feels like they will never find their voice?" Paisley considered the question carefully before answering. "I would tell them that their voice is already there, already perfect, already valuable. They don't need to find it or fix it or change it to match what other people expect. They just need to find communities that know how to listen, and sometimes that means helping create those communities themselves." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces representing educators from around the world. "And I would tell them that being different isn't something to overcome. It's something to contribute. The world needs their unique perspective, their particular way of seeing and expressing and understanding. We're not trying to make everyone the same. We're trying to create space for everyone to be magnificently, authentically themselves." As the session concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, many stopped to speak personally with Paisley, Emma, and Trevor. The conversations that followed would lead to new programs in dozens of countries, policy changes in major school districts, and most importantly, individual transformations in how thousands of educators understood their role in nurturing human potential. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came from an unexpected source. As they were packing their equipment, a janitor who had been cleaning the back of the auditorium approached them hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said in accented English. "I hope you don't mind, but I listened to your presentation while I worked. My son, he doesn't speak much at school. Teachers say maybe something wrong with him, but hearing you, maybe something right with him instead." Paisley smiled, recognizing in his words the transformation that rippled far beyond formal educational systems. "There's definitely something right with him," she said, "and there's something right with you for believing that." As they left Chicago, the next morning, Paisley reflected on how far their message had traveled from that first moment of silence breaking in a school cafeteria. What had begun as one girl's journey back to voice had become a global conversation about the value of neurodiversity, the power of inclusive communities, and the infinite ways human beings could connect with and support each other. The girl who had once been mocked for her silence was now leading an international movement. But more importantly, she had helped create a world where the next silent child wouldn't have to wait 3 years to discover that their voice, whatever form it took, was already perfect exactly as it was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.